What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Charles II love life was even crazier than Henry VIII. Charles II of England, also known as the Merry Monarch, was famous for his love life. His mistresses were prominent and necessary courtiers. Stories of their affairs with the king, and their rivalries with each other, have echoed through the centuries. Charles, who was born in 1630, spent much of his early adulthood in exile. His father, Charles I, was ousted from the throne and executed in 1649. While a puritanical regime ruled over England, Charles bided his time on the continent. In 1661, England's Parliament invited Charles to come home and become king. This restoration of the monarchy ushered in a new phase in English history. Charles had some accomplishments during his 25 years on the throne. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, opening theatres in London and sponsoring the Royal Society for Scientific Study. Charles, on the other hand, is best known for having a love life that was even more insane than Henry VIII. Henry, like Charles, had a number of mistresses, but it was his many marriages that made him famous. Henry was as likely to divorce a wife as to kill one, and he ended his marriages as quickly as he entered them. Much of Henry's bedroom politics increasingly focused on his desire to produce a male heir, though his poor health slowed him down in his later years. If Henry VIII's love life was deadly, Charles II was bawdy. He never let marriage get in the way of a good affair. Charles was a frequent adulterer who freely and openly had colorful, public relationships with a number of women. These mistresses came from all kinds of backgrounds and were well known by courtiers and commoners alike. They managed their own plots and frequently found themselves at the center of court politics. He had over a dozen children who were not his own, but he never had a legitimate child. Though Charles was married to Catherine of Braganza, the marriage never produced any children. Much to her dismay, Catherine had several pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. Charles fathered several illegitimate children, however. Though historians quibble on the exact number, he may have had 16 or more. Charles financially supported and doted upon them. James, Charles's younger brother, took over as king in 1685 because he did not have any legal heirs. One mistress was a French spy Charles nicknamed Phobs. Louise de Keroualle came to England for the first time in 1670 as a member of Charles II's sister's entourage. Charles soon became infatuated with her and installed her as his mistress. Louise, like many of Charles's other mistresses, was aware that her connection to the king was ultimately one of politics. She was, in fact, a French spy. She was part of a direct line of information via the French ambassador to King Louis XIV of France. According to all accounts, Charles was deeply in love with Louise and acknowledged that it is impossible to adequately express the genuine affection and kindness he feels for his closest friends. His term of affection for her was Phobs. Louise stayed by Charles's side until his passing. Charles had a servant who was known as his Pimpmaster. Charles II, King of England and Scotland, employed a servant for everything, including acquiring female companionship. Charles's bedroom was officially under William Chiffinch's control. However, he was referred to as the king's Pimpmaster General informally. Chiffinch recruited potential mistresses for Charles. He recruited women from all walks of life in London, not just well-connected noblewomen. Barbara Palmer, nicknamed the Uncrowned Queen, insisted on birthing Charles's illegitimate child in a palace. One of Charles's most controversial mistresses was Barbara Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland and the Countess of Castlemaine, who adored all the trappings, wealth, and privileges that came with her position. Palmer, who was referred to as the Uncrowned Queen, was not afraid to exert herself in court. When Charles married Catherine of Braganza in 1662, Palmer displayed her undergarments at Whitehall Palace. This action, according to historic royal palaces, demonstrated Palmer's opposition to the marriage as well as his claim to ownership over Charles and the court. Palmer went above and beyond to demonstrate her authority. When Palmer gave birth to one of Charles's illegitimate children, she insisted on doing so at Hampton Court Palace, one of the royal estates. Many resented Barbara Palmer's influence over Charles. According to court diarist Samuel Pepys, Palmer rules him, who, he says, hath all the tricks of artin that are to be practiced to give pleasure. Nell Gwynn once outmaneuvered a rival mistress by slipping her a laxative. Charles II frequently had multiple mistresses at once. This sometimes stoked rivalries between them as they tried to outmaneuver one another for the king's attention and favor. One story claims that Nell Gwynn went to extreme lengths to prevent Charles from seeing Moll Davis, another royal mistress. Before Davis was supposed to have a rendezvous with the king, Gwynn added a laxative to Davis's meal, thus making her indisposed for the remainder of the night. Charles's first lover may have been his former nurse. Charles was 14 years old when he may have taken his first lover, Christabella Wyndham. Wyndham wasn't just any lady of the court, she had an intimate connection with Charles. When he was a baby, she had been his nurse. The fact that Wyndham had nursed the young prince did not seem to dissuade the couple, however. He was attracted to actresses. Charles II reopened theaters that had been closed since 1642 when he took the throne in 1660. The revival of English theaters also brought something new: professional actresses who had previously been banned from performing on stage. At least two of Charles's mistresses were actresses. As a stage performer, Nell Gwynn was already well known before she became a royal mistress. Charles's affair with Moll Davis, pictured at right, another actress, brought her considerable wealth too. Charles persuaded his wife to take his mistress' place. In 1662, Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Unfortunately for Catherine, Charles was already several years into an affair with Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine. Charles was so devoted to Palmer that he once quipped, "Whosoever I find to be my Lady Castlemaine's enemy, I do promise upon my word to be his enemy so long as I live." Queens were apparently no exception to this mandate. Charles expected his new wife to accept his affairs, and the couple entered into a marital fight that spilled over into the court. Charles prevailed in the end, and despite the Queen's strong objections, he blatantly appointed Palmer as Catherine's lady of the bedchamber. When Palmer was shown to Catherine, she passed out because she was so scandalized. Despite his frequent affairs, the failure to produce a legitimate heir, and the advice of others, Charles never attempted to divorce Catherine. It's possible that Hortense Mancini had a relationship with Charles's illegitimate daughter as well. Hortense Mancini, a member of the so-called Mazarinettes and a Roman-born niece of Cardinal Mazarin, was Charles's mistress for a brief time. But Charles wasn't the only member of his family with whom she had a romantic relationship. Mancini and Anne Leonard, Countess of Sussex, one of Charles's illegitimate children with Barbara Palmer, may have had their own affair. When the teenaged, married Countess Sussex wanted to stay with Mancini rather than her husband, she was shipped off to a French convent. Mistresses often warred with one another and jockeyed for influence at court. Charles II lavished gifts on his mistresses. In other words, being a royal mistress was an incredibly lucrative business. His mistress Barbara Palmer even had access to the privy purse, and he gamely settled her significant debts. Due to the power, wealth, and privilege that came with serving as a royal mistress, women often jockeyed with one another to win Charles's attention and affection. Nell Gwynn, one of Charles's favorite mistresses, became a folk hero. Nell Gwynn, an actress who became Charles's mistress, was unlike many of Charles's other lovers because she was born and raised in London's slums. But her bravery, wit, and general good humor helped her win over both the king and the kingdom. She was even affectionately referred to as Pretty Witty Nell by the diarist Samuel Pepys. Commoners, in particular, celebrated Gwynn. To them she was, as historian Leslie Carroll put it, the goddess of the gutter snipes, and a bona fide celebrity. Her response to the London crowd's misidentification of her as another royal mistress, a French Catholic named Louise de Keroualle, received cheers. "Pray good people be civil, I am the Protestant rear." Some courtiers tried to leverage power by supplanting Charles's mistresses and installing their own. The royal bed was undeniably a political space. Royal mistresses could therefore potentially exert a significant amount of power. By ensuring that the appropriate women had the king's ear, some officials and courtiers attempted to increase their power. Ralph Montague, an ambassador to France, attempted to usurp Barbara Palmer as the king's mistress by making Hortense Mancini the king's lover. Palmer, on the other hand, increased her own power over Charles by introducing him to other potential partners, particularly those she could control. Charles II's love life was even crazier than Henry VIII. King Charles II of England, known as the Merry Monarch, lived a life of scandal, excess, and unbridled passion that made even Henry VIII's notorious marital escapades seem tame by comparison. While Charles II's rule was defined by a hedonistic court where mistresses reigned supreme, political intrigue was laced with seduction, and royal bastards outnumbered legitimate heirs. Henry VIII's reign was marked by his desperate quest for a male heir, which resulted in 6 marriages, 2 divorces, and 2 executions. Charles had a series of public affairs with women from all walks of life, including actors, aristocrats, and even spies, unlike Henry, who used marriage as a tool for power and succession. His love life was not just a private matter but a spectacle that shaped court politics, influenced foreign relations, and left a legacy of illegitimate children who would go on to shape British nobility. From his infamous Pimpmaster servant to mistresses who openly warred for his favor, Charles II's reign was a whirlwind of lust, betrayal, and political maneuvering that makes him one of history's most scandalous monarchs. A king with a dozen barbarians but no heirs. Charles II's marriage to Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, was a diplomatic alliance rather than a love match. Though Catherine was devoted to her husband, their union was plagued by miscarriages and stillbirths, leaving the king without a legitimate heir. This failure to produce a successor would eventually lead to his brother James II inheriting the throne, a decision that would later spark the Glorious Revolution. However, Charles more than made up for his lack of legitimate children with his illegitimate children. Historians estimate he fathered at least 16 bastards by various mistresses, many of whom he openly acknowledged, ennobled, and financially supported. Unlike many kings who discreetly hid their affairs, Charles flaunted his mistresses and their children, integrating them into court life. His favorite people, like the Duke of Monmouth, who was the son of Lucy Walter, went on to become important political figures. However, Monmouth later rebelled against James II and was executed. The uncrowned queen, Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland. If Charles II had a chief mistress, it was Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine and Duchess of Cleveland, a woman so powerful she was often called the uncrowned queen. Beautiful, cunning, and fiercely ambitious, Barbara wielded immense influence over the king, even dictating political appointments and controlling access to him. Barbara made Charles and Catherine of Braganza feel her presence even before Charles married Catherine of Braganza. When Catherine arrived in England as the new queen, Barbara staged a brazen power move by hanging her bedsheets at Whitehall Palace, a symbolic claim over the king. She also insisted on giving birth to one of Charles's children at Hampton Court Palace, forcing the queen to endure the humiliation of her husband's infidelity under her own roof. Court diarist Samuel Pepys wrote that Barbara rules the king as she pleases, and Charles himself once declared, "Whosoever I find to be my Lady Castlemaine's enemy, I do promise upon my word to be his enemy so long as I live." This loyalty extended even to his wife. When Catherine tried to resist Barbara's presence, Charles forced her to accept Barbara as a lady of the bedchamber, a position that required daily interaction. The queen was so distraught she reportedly fainted upon hearing the news. The French spy in his bed, Louise de Keroualle. Louise de Keroualle became Charles's most politically threatening lover during his early reign, when Barbara Palmer was his most dominant mistress. A French noblewoman sent to England as part of his sister's entourage, Louise was widely suspected of being a spy for King Louis XIV. "'Tis impossible to express the true passion and kindness I have for my dearest Fubs," Charles wrote to her in a passionate letter, nicknaming her Fubs, a term of endearment. Louise used her position to advance French interests, ensuring England remained friendly, or at least neutral, toward France during tense diplomatic negotiations. Her influence was so great that when she gave birth to Charles's son, the Duke of Richmond, Louis XIV himself acted as godfather, a clear sign of her political value. Unlike Barbara, who was brash and volatile, Louise was calculating and refined, making her one of the few mistresses who retained Charles's affection until his death. The people's mistress, Nell Gwyn, a former orange seller turned actress who won the king's heart with her wit and charm, was perhaps the most beloved of Charles's mistresses. Unlike the aristocratic Barbara and Louise, Nell was a commoner, making her a folk hero among Londoners. Her sharp tongue and playful nature made her a favorite at court. When an angry mob once mistook her carriage for Louise de Keroual's, a French Catholic unpopular with the English public, Nell famously quipped, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd cheered, and the story became legend. Nell's rivalry with other mistresses was just as entertaining. In one famous incident, she allegedly put a laxative in the food of another actress mistress, Moll Davis, so that she wouldn't be able to meet the king that night. Charles treated Nell well despite her modest upbringing, giving her a nice house and a pension. On his deathbed, his last words were reportedly, "Let not poor Nellie starve," showing a genuine affection that went beyond mere lust. The king's Pimpmaster, William Chiffinch. Charles' II's insatiable appetite for women required a dedicated facilitator. Enter William Chiffinch, the king's Pimpmaster General. Officially, Chiffinch was the keeper of the king's private closet, but his real job was procuring women for Charles, whether noble ladies or London actresses. Chiffinch made certain that the king's affairs remained somewhat private thanks to his extensive network that reached across all levels of society. He was also in charge of smuggling women into the palace through secret passages. This system allowed Charles to have relationships without being constantly watched by the public. The first lover, his former nurse. Charles's sexual escapades may have begun earlier than most realize, with Christabella Wyndham, his former wet nurse. When Charles was just 14 years old, rumors swirled that the much older Wyndham had seduced him. Whether true or exaggerated, the story set the tone for a lifetime of scandalous relationships. Mistress wars, poison, politics, and power struggles. With so many women vying for the king's attention, rivalry was inevitable. Barbara Palmer, ever the strategist, sometimes recruited new mistresses herself to control who had access to Charles. In the meantime, courtiers like Ralph Montague tried to put in place their own favorites, like Hortense Mancini, to get political clout. Hortense's story took another twist when she allegedly began an affair with Anne Leonard, Countess of Sussex, Charles's own illegitimate daughter by Barbara Palmer, to avoid further scandal, and was swiftly sent to a French convent after she left her husband to live with Hortense. A legacy of scandal. Charles II's love life was deeply political and not just about pleasure. His mistresses influenced foreign policy, controlled court appointments, and even affected the line of succession. Yet unlike Henry VIII, whose marriages led to religious upheaval and executions, Charles's affairs were marked by a hedonistic tolerance. He never divorced Catherine, despite pressure to remarry for an heir, and his mistresses, though often vicious rivals, were mostly allowed to thrive. In the end, Charles's reign was a celebration of excess, a stark contrast to the Puritan rule that preceded him. Actresses became countesses, spies became lovers, and royal brats became dukes at his court. Charles II lived a wild, unapologetic era that established him as England's merriest monarch, whereas Henry VIII had a deadly love life. Charles II's love life, on the other hand, was delightfully debauched. Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch, had a love life so wild and sprawling that it arguably outshone the notorious romantic escapades of Henry VIII. While Henry VIII's scandalous marital history, marked by 6 wives, multiple divorces and executions, has long captured historical imagination, Charles II's colorful and bawdy affairs painted an even more vivid picture of royal indulgence and court intrigue. Charles II openly embraced a lifestyle of amorous adventure, frequently flouting convention with a cavalier attitude toward marriage and fidelity. In contrast to Henry, whose matrimonial pursuits were frequently fueled by dynastic desperation to secure a male heir, Charles II did not. His court was well known for having a lot of mistresses who were not only visible but also had a big impact on how politics and society worked at the time. The tangled web of the king's relationships produced a legacy that included rivalry, scandal, espionage, and even elements of folklore. This made the Restoration era one of England's most dramatic romantic eras. Born in 1630, Charles spent much of his youth in exile following the execution of his father, Charles I, in 1649 during the English Civil War. For over a decade, he lived abroad while England was governed by a puritanical regime under Oliver Cromwell. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and Charles was invited back as king, he ushered in a new age of cultural revival, reopening theaters and sponsoring the Royal Society, but it was his personal life that truly captured the public's attention. Charles's reputation was shaped not only by his political actions but also by the numerous affairs he had over the course of his 25-year reign. The king never had a legitimate heir with his queen, Catherine of Braganza, despite having more than a dozen illegitimate children with a variety of women. After Charles's death in 1685, his brother James took over as the next of kin, and none of Catherine's subsequent pregnancies were successful. Charles had a wide range of well-known mistresses. They came from noble families, the theatre, and even humble London origins, each woman weaving herself into the complex tapestry of court life. Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland, was one of his most well-known mistresses, and her influence earned her the moniker, the uncrowned queen. Palmer flaunted her status with bold public displays of power, such as exhibiting her undergarments at Whitehall Palace in an ostentatious gesture that symbolized both protest against the Queen's presence and a claim to the king himself. Despite Catherine's strong objections, she held a position in the Queen's household because she was so involved in court politics. At one point, the Queen fainted when Palmer presented. Barbara Palmer emphasized her elevated status by insisting that she gave birth to several of Charles's illegitimate children in royal palaces. Samuel Pepys, a diarist, referred to her mastery of pleasure and control as all the tricks of Artin, a well-known libertine from the Renaissance. Not all of Charles's mistresses were highborn. Nell Gwynn, one of his favorite companions,